But first up now, I just want to go to a very unusual controversy that's arisen over, of all things, edible Australian plants. If you've ever eaten a wattle seed pavlova or a quandong tart, you'll know what we're talking about here. There's some fantastic recipes around at various restaurants. Now, all kinds of plants and animals increasingly are being incorporated from our indigenous heritage into our modern cuisine. Many of you will know of Jock Zonfrillo. He's now a television chef, and his Arana restaurant in Adelaide has been a national and international sensation, partly because of these indigenous ingredients. Well, Zonfrillo won a grant, a government grant from the state government of South Australia 4 years ago, more than $1 million, to establish a database of native foods. Now, no one's claiming that Zonfrillo has done anything wrong here at all. On the contrary, all power to him. But it's raised a few questions. One is the indigenous perspective on all this, which I'll get to in just a moment. The other is whether someone else had already collected all this information. Remember this bloke?
I guess I spend about 8 months a year chasing up bush tucker all over Northern Australia. And the idea is, of course, that the Department of Defence, and particularly the Army, have got an interest in this sort of thing. Because if ever we have soldiers out in the paddock, they may need to know it. I get the information by visiting Aboriginal people and Aboriginal communities, and they feed back that local information that I don't have.
That's the original bush tucker man, Les Hiddins, and he joins me now from Cairns in far north Queensland. Thanks for joining us, Les. Gee, I loved that show. One of the best things the ABC ever did. But essentially, that was your task in that show and in your professional life with the Army, was getting that information from Indigenous Australians and creating a database, right?
Yeah, well, originally, when I first started doing that work, we had a blank sheet of paper, and the Army let me cut loose, and we started to assemble the information, the photographs and all that sort of thing, so that we did, in fact, create a database. We were, at that stage, putting the information on the back of the Army maps, so that when you had a map, you could turn it over and see what was the relevant survival resources or bush tucker for that particular area.
Yeah, this was part of our defence preparedness. In case soldiers were needed to be dispatched to areas of Northern Australia, you had that information. Now, as we just saw in that clip, you were very open that this was knowledge you were getting from Indigenous Australians. Do you think that they got enough credit and enough involvement in the collation of all that material?
Well, yeah, I do, because we put that together and acknowledged the Aboriginal people and their input throughout the series. And without them, I would have been somewhat stranded. I did get other information from some people in Cape York that were tin scratchers and that sort of thing, who were very good at living off the land up there. But the vast majority came from either Aboriginal people or historical research with people like Alan Cribb in his books and some of the anthropologists that had already worked with Aboriginal people in the past.
Now, the reason you were doing this was very practical. What's been your thoughts looking on over the recent decades to see so many of these native foods going on to fine dining plates around the country, making it not only broadening the appeal, but making it actually commercially profitable?
Well, that's an area that I don't get into, and I don't think I've ever been to one of the restaurants that dish it up. You know?
You've eaten your native food in the proper way, not at a fancy restaurant.
Yeah, and I haven't had to pay a high price for it either.
Now, does it surprise you then when you find that Jock Zonfrillo's been paid a government grant to put all this information together? Don't you think you have most of that information in a database, at least for the north of the country?
Oh, yeah, for Northern Australia, we got it pretty well covered, pretty well nailed. And I've covered that a little bit in some of the print media that I've published over the years, some of the books and that sort of thing. And what I've done in more recent times is converted that information across to an electronic database via the internet. Because don't forget, when I did this work, there was no such thing as the internet. I didn't even have a computer back in those days.
You're ageing us now. It was a terrific program. When did you go to air on the ABC? What years was that?
Oh, crikey, that would be about 30 years ago now, I think, you know. It'd have to be 30 years ago, whatever year that was.
And you still get out into...
89.
You still spend plenty of time in the bush?
I was up there last week, actually. And you wouldn't believe it, I was up there on a particular cattle property north of Cooktown, being driven around in a Land Rover by a young kid who was 9 years old, could barely look over the top of the steering wheel, and he was taking me to his favourite yabby spot.
Fantastic stuff. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully we can catch up again sometime.
Okay, good on you, Chris.
That's the Les Hiddins there, who, of course, produced that documentary series with the ABC, The Bush Tucker Man. He's already done so much of that work with all the input from Indigenous communities across Northern Australia. But let's get the Indigenous perspective on this at the moment. I'm joined by Indigenous elder Jeffrey Newchurch and Yunda Murrah, who runs the Red Centre Enterprises. They're joining me via Skype from Magoola. Thanks for joining us, gentlemen. What's your thoughts first, Yunda Murrah, on Jock Zonfrillo getting a grant to put all this information together? Don't you think it would have been something that an Indigenous company or organisation might have been contracted to do?
I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and definitely it did raise some eyebrows around Australia with different communities. It's not a new industry. Just prior to this, we saw the Bush Tucker Man and have fond memories of growing up and hearing the old people talk about the stories and what they were doing in the industry. The data in a lot of areas is already there, and yeah, I did find it very surprising. They also talk about ownership of the traditional knowledge and where that sits, and it needs to sit under Aboriginal corporations or mainstream. It actually needs to remain with the communities, and I think that's sometimes forgotten by other custodians, that knowledge.
And Jeffrey, do you like the fact that so many people are interested in this now, that there's actually a competition, I suppose, to get this knowledge and put it onto people's plates?
Well, as you know, Les, I used to watch that show, Bush Tucker Man. It was a character of the man, and how he portrayed himself to go out there in the community and work with the community to gain that knowledge, and also put that knowledge out in the wider world space where, you know, that can be equated, where we all have that form of, you know, utilising the benefits of our native industry. Where it came surprisingly in 2016 with the former Labor government, where their push was to push with other interest parties, non-Aboriginal, to acquire these knowledges. When one looks at the partnership with Zoc had with the Adelaide University and, you know, other players, and then one being SA Museum that holds a lot of history data there for not only Ghana but all Aboriginal people in their collections. And it was a use of, you know, their way of doing business was for whom's gain, certainly not for the gain of us as Aboriginal people.
Yeah, well, I think that's what most people would expect. It's your information, and you should have some role in it. Yunda Murrah, just finally, when we talk about Les Hiddins, who did a lot of this work for the Army, that data is there, and he gives all credit to the Indigenous communities that have shared that with him. Of course, he hasn't done Southern Australia and Tasmania. There must be other plants, other foodstuffs, other parts of the country that perhaps this information has not been collated for.
You're correct, and what is amazing is there's a lot of Aboriginal organisations out there doing some amazing work, and partnerships of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians working to walk together and create win-wins for regional or remote areas. And that information does exist, and in part with the community, but to take that knowledge then and actually look at accumulating that knowledge and being able to validate that information. There's not a lot of infrastructure and resources, understandings around the requirements there.
Well, good luck with your continuing work in this area, and thanks for joining us, Yunda Murrah and Jeffrey Newchurch.
No worries, thank you.
Appreciate your time, thank you.